So we keep talking about the progressive era. The apush loves the progressive era. Progressivism is just change. It's like huge change in efforts to move society forward. Social, political, and economic reforms that came as an American response to problems caused by industrialization, urbanization, and immigration. So you have the Gilded Age, which is when, like the Industrial Revolution, everything gets dipped in gold. It becomes money. And progressivism is fix all the bad stuff caused by that. The democratic reforms were made throughout the states and the national government, including 16th, 17th, and 19th constitutional amendments. The 18th prohibition is kind of progressivism, but it had a lot of other issues as well. The Sherman Antitrust Act, it was based on Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce, and it declared that every contract, combination, or conspiracy and restraint of interstate trade was illegal. Corporate monopolies were exposed to federal prosecution if they were found to conspire in restraining trade. And then the Supreme Court is going to be active in enforcing this new finding. The Populist Party is going to be one of the big political parties that emerges during the progressive era. It consisted mostly of farmers who met in Nebraska, and they wrote what was called the Omaha Platform. Their demands included free and unlimited coinage of silver, a graduated income tax, and government ownership of the telephone, telegraph, and railroad industries. These were later adopted into the Progressive Party, which combines the Populist Party with industrial workers. The Homestead Strike, iron and steel workers' strike that were against Carnegie Steel Company. Remember, this is when Frick goes in and he gets really bad and evil in Men Who Made America. He is going to hire the Pinkerton Security Guards, which was kind of like a private army force almost, to protect Carnegie's plant. But fighting resulted in deaths among both the protesters and the guards, and eventually the Pennsylvania State Militia was brought in to take control. Remember, this whole time Carnegie is back home in Scotland, so he felt personally guilty, although his involvement isn't direct. Eugene V. Debs, he's that dude who runs for president like 5,000 times and never gets it. He's a commie. He ran for jail, including one time. He became president of the American Railroad Union in 1893, which is going to lead successful strikes against some of the other large railroad companies. He's a founder of the Socialist Party in America, the Social Democratic Party, and he's going to run for president 5 different times between 1900 and 1920. Hawaii at this time was being colonized by America for their sugar plantations, and it's going to expand American and Hawaiian sugar trade. We're also going to use it for an important naval port. The queen at the time of Hawaii, though, was Queen Liliuokalani, and she was opposed to foreigners, and so she is going to lead rebellions against the wealthy plantation owners from America who were there, and there's going to be several revolutions that go back and forth. Ultimately, Liliuokalani was basically removed, and Stanford Dole, who was the son of American missionaries in Hawaii, is going to lead the movement to annex Hawaii, and he's going to become the first governor, and eventually, therefore, in the 1950s, Hawaii is going to become a state. Frederick Winslow Taylor was important in terms of making industries more efficient. He is the basis for the scientific management of business in his quest of efficiency. He used shops and large plants as models and succeeded in spreading his ideas on efficiency to several industries. He researched a lot about how plants like factories and stuff like that could be more efficient with every behavior. And he wrote books on the subject of scientific management. In terms of the role of the sea, there was this dude, again, Alfred Thayer Mahan, who was a naval officer and historian, and he's going to write a really important book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660 to 1783. And in it, he's going to basically justify America's continued dominance of the oceans in the late 1800s into the early 1900s. Themes in this book were used as partial justification for us taking over the Philippines. Plessy v. Ferguson is one of the most important Supreme Court cases in American history because it establishes the idea of separate but equal facilities, saying that it was okay to separate the races in public institutions so long as, quote, everything was separate but equal. But there was no real enforcement of the equality, and very often the minorities received institutions, whether they be buildings, bathrooms, train cars in the case of this or whatever, that were of an inferior quality. There was one dude, Justice Harlan, who dissented, saying that all citizens are equal before the law, but most people did not agree with it at the time, and it's going to take until 1954 with the Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court case to overturn Plessy v. Ferguson. W.E.B. Du Bois was a civil rights leader and an author. He's going to call for full equality of African Americans, including social, civil, political, and economic equality. He is opposed to Booker T. Washington. Booker T. was far more into a gradualist approach to equality. W.E.B. Du Bois wanted it now. He is going to be a huge supporter in terms of higher education, though, however, and he wanted to develop leaders from the most talented, intelligent, or wealthy 10% of African Americans and call them the talented 10th. He's also going to co-found the Niagara Movement, which eventually is going to become the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, so the NAACP. So that's probably his most important contribution, is being a co-founder of the NAACP, which to this day is one of the largest civil rights organizations in America. The Cross of Gold speech was an address given by William Jennings Bryan, who was the Democratic presidential nominee, and he gives the speech actually during one of the Democratic Party national conventions. The speech criticized the gold standard and supported the use of silver, which was a belief popular with debt-ridden farmers. The last words of his speech, and the most famous, were, "You shall not pass down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." And people were really moved by it. William McKinley was the 25th president. He was a former Republican congressman from Ohio, and he is going to defeat Bryan, even though Bryan was probably more popular, mainly because McKinley is going to spend more money than any other president up until that time. He's going to tour the country. He's going to stay at homes. Bryan tours the country. McKinley stays at his house and instead has people come to his house, opens the door, and he kind of tries to create this presidential image. And he's going to ultimately win in 1896, which is going to disillusion the Progressive Party because they were so certain that their candidate was the better one. This is going to influence future political races by setting up the idea of interest groups and alliances. He was elected in 1900 again, but he was assassinated by Leon Czolgosz, who was an anarchist. Marcus Alonzo Hanna was an American capitalist who was dealing in coal, shipping, shipbuilding, all that stuff, banking, and newspapers. He was active in the Ohio Republican Party, and he was pretty important in terms of getting William McKinley elected to governor in 1891 and 1893. He was the chairman of the Republican National Committee, and he assisted McKinley in winning the presidential election of 1896. The open door policy was our foreign policy for dealing with China, where we were trying to kind of restore some of that Chinese Exclusionary Act and some of the negative feelings that came from it. We had become a major commercial power in Asia after we acquired the Philippines, and so we had business interests in China, but Europe and Japan started to make moves to take over pieces of China, and that threatened us. So President McKinley is going to send Secretary of State John Hay over to China and try to have him do negotiations with Europe and Japan to basically leave our goods alone. Hay is going to announce an agreement by all parties in July of 1900, although there were a lot of people in China who were kind of sick of all of this, and they're going to be called the Boxers, and so they're going to rebel against foreigners, so it's the Boxer Rebellion. And it's going to go on to influence U.S. foreign policy with China for years to come. The Teller Amendment dealt with Cuba. This said that we would help Cuba to get rid of Spain in its war for independence, and in exchange, we were going to give Cuba basically their complete independence. But after the Spanish-American War, we passed the Platt Amendment, which basically gets rid of the Teller Amendment and says that Cuba is going to be at least in part under our control. So speaking of the Spanish-American War, basically what happened here was Cuba was colonized by Spain. Cuba got mad. Cuba fought back. We finally jumped on board, partially due to the yellow journalism, partially due to the explosion of one of our ships, the USS Maine. So we jump in. We got Teddy Roosevelt, who leads the Rough Riders up San Juan Hill. and some other battles that are going to take place. It's a very quick war. It doesn't really cost us that much, and we're going to be successful in winning. And as a result, the Treaty of Paris gives Cuba its independence. We gain Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, which were all Spanish protectorates. And then Spain is going to get some money from us in exchange for the Philippines. In terms of Puerto Rico and the United States, in 1900, Congress passes the Foraker Act, which gave Puerto Rico limited popular government. In 1917, American citizenship was granted to the Puerto Ricans. As I said with the Platt Amendment, this was attached to an Army Appropriations Bill, so it was kind of like an amendment, if you want to think of it that way. It wasn't a whole bill. That basically said that in the Cuban Constitution, Cuba had to recognize the U.S. Constitution. We had the right to intervene in Cuba for any needs that we thought would preserve its independence, and that we also got some land in Cuba to set up a military naval base, which would be Guantanamo Bay. That's going to serve as the justification for our involvement with the Bay of Pigs about 60 years later. Teddy Roosevelt takes over when McKinley is assassinated. He becomes the 26th president. He was probably one of our most powerful presidents without letting the power go too much to his head. He was a war hero during the Spanish-American War. He becomes a trust buster, using the Sherman Antitrust Act to dissolve the trusts and go after big business like Carnegie and Rockefeller. And he's going to win the antitrust cases. And he had a style of diplomacy that he said, like, speak softly and carry a big stick. And he's going to use that mentality of, like, speaking softly and going in, so, like, ease him in, get him into a lull of full security, and then hit him hard. And that's going to be instrumental in him getting us in Latin America, including the creation of the Panama Canal. He's also going to broker gentlemen's agreements between us and Russia, and us and Japan and Russia, and a whole bunch of other countries. And he was a super big supporter of conservation of national resources. Muckrakers are American journalists, novelists, and critics who exposed corruption, especially in business and politics. President Teddy Roosevelt is credited with giving them their name. Famous muckrakers included Upton Sinclair, Ida Tarbell, Lincoln Stevens, Frank Norris, and Samuel Hopkins Adams, and it led to an increased support for the progressive movement. Into their cases were a series of court cases which helped to determine if the Constitution followed the flag. In other words, like, if we gain land, and that land become part of us, does the Constitution apply to them? At stake was whether the people in areas controlled by the U.S. were given rights as citizens, so like the Filipinos, for example, the Hawaiians. The court determined that those living in the new territories were not automatically granted the rights of U.S. citizens. Upton Sinclair was a novelist and a socialist, and he used his writings to expose issues in U.S. society, especially in terms of the meat packing plants, when he wrote a book called The Jungle, which was a pretty graphic book about the horrors and atrocities of the Chicago shipyards. And so it's eventually going to lead to the passage of various laws to help with the Food and Drug Administration. He's also going to win a Pulitzer Prize. Muller v. Oregon. Oregon established a law that limited women to 10 hours of work in factories and laundries, and Muller, who was a laundry owner, challenged the legality of that law, arguing that it violated the liberty to contract. Louis Brandeis, who was one of the attorneys at the time, and then he's going to eventually become a member of the Supreme Court and a whole bunch of stuff. He works his way up real fast. He used extensive sociological evidence in his brief, which was called the Brandeis Brief, which served as a model for later social reforms, and the Supreme Court held that the law was constitutional. Henry Ford made cars, but he's actually more important in terms of how he made them. The Model T was the pioneering car, where it was fairly inexpensive and allowed for the mass production as well as the mass availability of automobiles. But because he used an assembly line, he could make them really, really fast, so most people could afford them. He also treated his workers relatively decently, paying his workers $5 a day, which was more than double the average auto worker's wage. He was strongly anti-union. Taft, 27th president, he is the fat one. He was the one who comes after Teddy Roosevelt. He is going to prosecute trusts under the Sherman Antitrust Act. He also uses dollar diplomacy, which called for acting in foreign affairs to achieve a financial result. His administration created the Department of Labor and established the old mail system. And when his relationship deteriorated, Taft loses the presidency and becomes Supreme Court Chief Justice of the Supreme Court instead.